As I described in my new zine called The Sad Gay Catholic, which is available on my website and for which I worked really hard and you should totally get it, I grew up Catholic, which explains about 35% of the insanity probably. Throughout my childhood, I went to Mass more often than not. In retrospect, this was probably just a way for my admittedly liberal and not very religious parents to get free childcare for me and my sister, but it still put a lot of weird teachings into my young and mushy brain. Sunday school left quite a few scars on me, to be completely honest. Scars that I am still unpacking today. There is a reason why my very first zine is about Catholicism, queer identities, and mental illness. I happen to have a lot to say about those things. And with all of these emotions around my religious upbringing, it's no surprise that I jumped on the bandwagon as soon as I learned about New Atheism. New Atheism was a movement with the ambitious goal of further separating our social, personal, and political lives from religion. The pipe dream of the movement was to get rid of religion altogether, since religion was considered an evil force that not only justified but also caused many evils of the world. Now, religion is one of the most persistent aspects of civilization. It's a deep human urge, like fucking and painting stuff on the wall. So New Atheism's ambition was utopian, to say the least. It would have been considered nonsense even just a decade prior to imagine a world without religion, but in the 2000s it really seemed possible. And progressives on the internet were really convincing themselves that society had moved past the need for religion. How did we get to such an unprecedented point in human history? Well, according to a random woman on the internet with no expertise in it, there are a few events in American culture that led up to New Atheism. The AIDS crisis of the 80s definitely contributed to this. The anti-LGBT rhetoric of the Reagan administration was openly cruel and extremely homophobic. If you know anything about queer history, you probably have already heard about Pat Buchanan's statement that, quote, "The poor homosexuals have declared war upon nature, and now nature is extracting an awful retribution." Slave. Or Reverend Jerry Falwell's declaration that, quote, "AIDS is a lethal judgment of God on the sin of homosexuality, and it is also the judgment of God on America for endorsing this vulgar, perverted, and reprobate lifestyle." It was bad. In fact, it was so bad that I suspect a lot of people realized that the God that they were worshipping in their private prayers was not the same God being weaponized by the Reagan administration to justify a literal genocide. AIDS crisis kind of shifted something in the reputation of religion. Secondly, the Pedialyte priest scandal in the 90s, really trying to not get demonetized. Why did I write about this section? This one was a culture shock. Because, it was just too evil to believe, you know what I mean? The very people who used the quote-unquote protect the children rhetoric for basically everything, now we're hurting kids in unthinkable and traumatic ways. And then the Catholic Church protected these monsters for way too long. To this day, fun fact, only one priest has been excommunicated among the dozens convicted. And then, when the Catholic Church couldn't protect them anymore, they blamed it on gay priests. Because of course they did! With such an unforgivable abuse of power, I can imagine that a lot of folks found themselves questioning their relationship with the church, with Catholicism, and with God himself. And thirdly, 9/11. The other two events I cited caused individuals to privately divest from Christianity and maybe stop going to church, but 9/11 is really when New Atheism was allowed into the mainstream. On the 11th of September 2001, when I asked why my favorite children's cartoon was not airing, my parents explained to me that something completely unprecedented had happened. Al-Qaeda, an Islamic terrorist organization, managed to fly 4 planes into various buildings, the most famous ones being the Twin Towers. This was arguably the straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe atheism was saying this God guy, this being that everyone thinks is on their side when they commit the most terrible atrocities in human history, maybe he's not so great after all. Maybe we should start questioning this whole God thing. And thus, New Atheism came to be. Welcome to a new era. I joke about it, but New Atheism really is a post-9/11 phenomenon. Nobody in their right mind would have sided with the 9/11 terrorists, of course, but many also felt a deep uneasiness with the way the President Bush was using the attack to justify the war. It didn't feel to pacifists, at least, like the US government was that much different from Islamic fundamentalists, considering how much the very American and very Christian God was used in the public discourse. Remember when George Bush said, quote, "God would tell me, George, go and fight these terrorists in Afghanistan." And I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq. And I did. That was very weird. Like, even for American politics, that was a very weird moment. So, in all of this chaos, I think atheism provided a third way, sympathizing neither with the terrorists, of course, nor with the American military. It felt intellectually more stimulating and emotionally safer to make a bipartisan critique and choose a more moderate, reasonable, and enlightened set of ideas. The sentiment expressed in Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, arguably the book of New Atheism, which came out in 2006, can be summarized as basically, fuck the church, fuck religion. It's completely unreasonable and bad for humanity. Kill it with fire. Quote, Dawkins, 2006. A few more years after 9/11 passed, and more households got blessed with an internet connection. And once the generation who saw 9/11 as children had grown up into teenagers and young adults, New Atheism became internet's favorite topic of conversation. This is the era that we all remember and love? Question mark? Let's not think about that. Millennials with an absolutely appropriate amount of free time made response videos. Remember response videos? Debunking the existence of God and owning Christian fundamentalists on YouTube. And I was eating this shit up. I was 14 and eating this shit up. Because atheism enjoys such a cringe reputation today, it's difficult to remember the genuine good that existed within New Atheism, but I would argue there was a lot of it. Like most internet niches, it was a disorganized mess and therefore very mixed bag. But I would argue that the emotional core of New Atheism wasn't bigoted rage or male insecurity or even a pathological attempt at morally condemning everything. New Atheism, instead, stemmed from the genuine desire to 1. Debate and contemplate intellectually stimulating questions. 2. Work through what we will now call religious trauma and ask ourselves politically challenging questions about the church. And 3. The genuine entertainment of watching someone stupid and self-righteous make a fool of themselves. Let's talk about all of these. Firstly, the philosophizing. I understand if you'll meet this paragraph with skepticism because, of course, 2008 YouTube is not exactly the first place people think about when they want to name an intellectually rich environment, so I get it. But I will passionately defend New Atheism on this front because it offered a way to wrestle with philosophically interesting questions in a way that felt very accessible. Nowadays, you bitches are spoiled by ContraPoints and FT Signifier and Visas and so many more on this platform, and that's a wonderful thing, but I ask you, who brought an intellectually curious audience who would sit through a 40+ minute long rambly-ass video essay about a philosophy they've never heard of that is filmed on a potato? Who brought that? That's right, New Atheism. And look, I'll gladly admit that most of the intellectual side of New Atheism was pretty shallow because it was YouTube, there was confirmation bias left and right, no recognition that theology is a genuine subset of philosophy with a rich and complex history. But also, you didn't have to dig that hard to find good book recommendations and interesting ideas. For a 14-year-old intellectually starved Costanza, it was an excellent starting point. The initial spark of my lifelong passion for philosophy, if you will. Secondly, the political and social critique of religion. This was, in my opinion, also a big selling point of the movement. Firstly, again, remember, this is a decidedly post-9/11 movement. A lot of millennials and Gen Z felt an intense need to criticize the political implications of religion because we grew up in the aftermath of 9/11. We had to witness an event which we weren't old enough to understand, and this event justified a war that wasn't fought in our name, so we were rightly pissed off. On top of that, I think New Atheism was emotionally appealing for a lot of women and queer folks specifically, because a lot of us grew up with the shame of a religious upbringing. Some of us had legitimate trauma around it. Some of us, not me, I did not write a zine about it. What are you talking about? But we didn't have the vocabulary to express it and explore it. Remember, this was all before the internet normalized mental health struggles. I think New Atheism provided a safe space to engage with our own rage and with our own pain, because it didn't shy away from difficult topics, but also it had a strong aura of intellectualism, which I think shielded us from the most emotionally difficult parts of divesting from religion. On top of that, criticizing religion is considered antisocial, because it's a very personal thing that often brings comfort to the darkest moments of one's life. So there is an intellectual thrill, I would argue, to criticizing religion that feels socially transgressive and cool and edgy. It's kind of like when you're 15 and you read Nietzsche and it becomes your entire personality for like 10 months. And frankly, I'm inclined to defend this side of New Atheism too, because religion is routinely used to justify all sorts of systemic horrors precisely because it is so eradicated in people's emotional lives. And therefore, I don't really think it should be exempt from scrutiny. Online atheism offered offered an avenue to discuss anti-religion talking points and even to organize politically around them. I was personally involved with the Italian association UAAR, which stands, I wish I was kidding, for Union of Agnostic and Atheist Rationalists. I can feel the eye rolls oozing from the screen as I say it because it's the most 2007 sounding ass name in the history of humanity, but they did start a lot of genuinely fantastic initiatives to help further separate the state and the church, mostly around the topics of abortion, queer rights, end-of-life care, and the importance of keeping schooling and religion separate. These are all pressing issues in Italy, so yeah, the political angle was a big factor for me. As a fun fact, I almost renounced my baptism during the later year of my high school because of an initiative by UAAR. In the end, I didn't do it, but I almost did it. And finally, I refused to pretend that online atheism was nothing but intellectual debate and political activism. There also was a lot of Christians being owned too. And for a lot of folks, that was the main appeal, or at least the reason why they got sucked into the space in the first place. And this dunking part of online atheism is the hardest one to defend, because a lot of it is juvenile and superficial. And there definitely also was a self-aggrandizing side to it that now feels very outdated. Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens and Dennett were named the Four Horsemen. It was cringe. I have admitted before it was cringe. But nothing can ever be as cringe as Christian fundamentalists. Like, those are ridiculous in transcendental ways.
La maggior parte, il 99,99% dei titolari delle ditte, delle imprese, hanno fatto successo perché bestemmiano Dio.
They are so embarrassing that they break the cringe measuring machine, okay? So dunking on them was often just fun brain candy. But I think there also was a genuine element of speaking truth to power.
Christopher, I'm not sure if you believe in heaven, but if you do you think Jerry Falwell is in it?
No, and I think it's a pity there isn't a hell for him to go to.
Like, in this clip, Hitchens is hilarious. His deadpan delivery makes me laugh out loud to this day, but he also is fucking correct. By the way, Falwell is the guy who said that AIDS is a divine punishment, in case you were scrolling your phone during the intro of this video. And frankly, he deserved every bit of the public humiliation he got. So fuck it, I'm defending the dunking on creationist soup. POV, it's 2011, we just finished hooking up and I'm showing you a Christopher Hitchens destroys religion with facts and logic compilation on my iPod Touch. The movement was also more diverse than we give it credit for. There were a lot of women and queer people in New Atheism, for what I said before, and going back to 9/11 again, I suspect that a lot of Muslims felt a need to distance themselves from the Islamic terrorists, but also from the very xenophobic rhetoric of the Bush administration. And I like to think, at least, that atheism provided an avenue for those complicated feelings. At least in the beginning, at least. We'll get to the Islamophobia later. I have a whole part on the Islamophobia. Atheism seemed like a common issue that transcended gender and sexuality barriers, making religion into both a giant force against which we can all be the underdog and the most irrational and dumb ideology there ever existed. It was the perfect political enemy. And frankly, a part of me thinks that this was long overdue. Like, the power that religion has over the state, over political discourse, and over the literal lives of people is unjustifiable. Like, this is just all true. Euthanasia, stem cell research, abortion, queer rights, these are all just a few of the things that are routinely opposed in the name of religion. And the quote Christian roots that ghouls like Matteo Salvini want to defend are often just extremely thin-veiled racism and xenophobia. New Atheism was publicly and vehemently claiming that religion is a genuinely evil force for society that should be eradicated. And honestly, I kind of find it hard to come up with compelling arguments against this. So, New Atheism definitely raised some good political points. However, New Atheism wasn't just the predecessor to leftist video essays and socialist debate bros. It also transformed into a lot of the bad stuff on YouTube, like the alt-right and Gamergate. Oh shit, I realize now that that sentence implies that debate bros are a good thing. Ooh. I want to talk about the Islamophobia that was very pervasive in New Atheism, but since that's quite the dense and lengthy topic, let me start my criticism of New Atheism from the more superficial stuff, the things that were ultimately just a bit petty or weird or stupid but not like problematic. Firstly, religion is not based on logic. In fact, faith is supposed to be an act of pure trust, believing without proof. We can definitely debate the ethics of making people, especially children, believe in something without asking questions, but that is the essence of religion. If people had rational proof of the existence of God, then believing wouldn't really be a test of their devotion. So, pointing out the quote-unquote logical fallacies within religion, even if the actual arguments are coherent and somewhat valid, is kind of missing the entire point. Secondly, even if religion is deserving of political scrutiny. On a personal level, it's sometimes the only thing that brings joy during the darkest moments of someone's life. So the vicious dunking that is so entertaining when done against creationists on national television suddenly feels pointlessly cruel when you start picturing widows, bereaved parents, and terminal cancer patients on the receiving end of it. It is not very rational to pray when our loved ones receive a cancer diagnosis, but it is very human. And fucking Sam Harris or whatever blabbering on about how religion takes advantage of vulnerable people, like, technically correct, but it misses the point so much that I'm left wondering if these people ever spoke to a real fucking human. Thirdly, New Atheism failed to acknowledge any positive influence that religion had on society, and so it failed to provide substitutes for those positives. Because, like, churches, synagogues, and mosques bring people together, they create community, and they are arguably the only intergenerational third place that we have left. Therefore, replacing them with something that is less harmful but equally bonding is extremely difficult. And also, the very things that New Atheism mocked about religion are the ones that bring people together. It is objectively irrational and maybe even silly to recite prayers and sing together, but rituals are the thing that creates community. The attempts at starting a new religion that this movement made, called Pastafarianism, also known as the Church of Flying Spaghetti Monster, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Like, this was 100% intended as a joke, right? It was an extension of the believing in God is like believing in Santa Claus mentality. It was like that, but to the extreme. I'll be the first one to say that the passport pictures of people with spaghetti strainers on their head, 11 out of 10 bit, no notes. But there is more to religion than just arbitrary rituals. There is a function to those rituals for the people. The rituals are often the glue that holds communities together. The best proof of this is the fact that New Atheism started the Church of Flying Spaghetti Monster as a joke. They made up a bunch of rituals for this fake religion with the explicit goal to mock the act of creating rituals, and then people bonded over those fake rituals. Like, they started off as having conventions and functions wearing spaghetti strainers as a joke, and then they actually became friends and did activism in the name of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And people were looking forward to go to Pastafarian functions. Like, that's just how humans make, you know what I mean? Like, you literally made a religion. That's all religion is. I also think, on top of that, it's important to remember that God is not an imaginary friend. God is not like Santa Claus, because God is a very powerful and influential social construct, one that has been there for millennia and therefore has immense social power. I think of God as man-made, but it's kind of like money or the internet. It has the power to shape people's lives, and it should be taken seriously because of it. Just because something is a social construct, it doesn't mean it's fake. I think overall, a lot of New Atheism failed to recognize the importance of religion for the fabric of society and the reason why it evolved. And therefore, I think they missed a very human side of history. Okay, now that we got the small stuff out of the way, and I'm sorry I had to make you sit through all of it, but I have literally been sitting on these stakes for 14 years. I had no choice. Let's address the Charlie Hebdo elephant in the room. I don't think the incredibly paternalistic and self-congratulatory vibe of New Atheism would have been much of a problem if it wasn't for the pretty severe racism and fucking Islamophobia the movement was drenched in. New Atheism was pretty much in agreement with progressive-ish politics about what the evils of the world are: sexism, anti-queer discrimination, racism, intolerance, poverty, etc. But the core claim of New Atheism was that religion is the main and sometimes only cause of these evils. And that is, in my opinion, very misguided. Now, it is objectively true that religion, in particular Christian evangelicals and the Catholic Church, have supported and enabled fascism in all sorts of ways. For the perfect example, we shall look at Italian history, because of course we fucking should. The Lateran Treaty is called Patti Lateranensi in Italian. It officially and publicly established that the Pope and the Catholic Church support Benito Mussolini. Yes, the dictator. Yes, the guy who invented fascism. We like it here so much. And this was fucking public. Anyway, I get so fucking mad at when I think about my country. And then there is all the ways in which Catholic orthodoxy, in my opinion, is inherently patriarchal, and it promotes the us versus them mentality that fascism builds upon. So yeah, the Catholic Church is evil, and kind of fascist, but I think New Atheism got the cause and the effect confused. Allow me to borrow from my personal life for a second. I've met a lot of people who are religious, and some of them are assholes, while some of them are wonderful people. In my experience, people who have a genuinely good character, that are kind and empathetic, because of course of a combination of nature and nurture, they will use God as an excuse and a reminder to be even more kind and even more good and even more empathetic. While people who are insecure and vindictive and mean and bigoted and close-minded and all of the things will resonate with the parts of the gospel that gives them excuses to be even more of a jackass. So God is not neutral in this equation, because the Bible actually does provide a lot of excuses to continue being bigoted assholes. But also, God is not what makes people bigoted. I think it's a lot more productive to understand bigotry as a sense of entitlement and disgust towards women and minorities. This sense is irrational. It's kind of like in your gut, and then we use all sorts of arguments and ideas and histories and whatever to justify that hatred. In other words, if bigots didn't have a God that allows them to be bigots, they would not stop being bigots, they would just use something else. I think the same approach should be taken to religion on a political scale. Religion is definitely one of the factors that keeps the status quo in a terrible state, and it is important to criticize it, because if there is a God, I find it very hard to believe that he supports trickle-down economics. But New Atheism was making the argument that religion was the only root of evil. And because of this, I think New Atheism ended up doing very poor social analysis and being quite xenophobic in the meanwhile. Because when this idea that religion is the root of all evil is directed towards Islam, the movement got really fucking Islamophobic really fucking fast. Saying religion makes people stupid and bigoted is incorrect and superficial, but ultimately harmless. But saying Islam makes people stupid and bigoted, that's just straight up racism. And New Atheism often hid the second sentence into the first one. This is what we call today a dog whistle, which is when a bigoted political idea is expressed not directly, but by twisting it into something more socially acceptable to say. I'm thinking specifically of Sam Harris's The End of Faith, which is full of these, because that's the one I read back in the days, but honestly, the whole movement was drenched in this kind of stuff. Like, for example, the idea that, quote-unquote, the West and Islam were at war, the idea that this is a civilizational threat, the idea that Muslim population is growing and this is a proof that Islam wants to, quote, replace us. There was a lot of what we now see as white supremacist talking points. And I think that by repeating these awful ideas, New Atheism really primed YouTube and the internet in general for the alt-right. Sam Harris in particular is delusionally convinced of the evils of Islam to this day, to the point, goddammit, that he is pro-Israel. Like you support the religious ethno-state in the name of atheism. Get a job! You lost the plot! This is not how you do it. This is, holy shit, my script says, this is dumb fuck political analysis, honestly. Honestly, yeah, I stand by my script, because, Islam is not a magical spell that makes people insane and barbaric and backwards or whatever the fuck. Islam is, like Christianity, a social construct. Sometimes it is used to justify horrible political decisions, but those political decisions are ultimately about money, power, colonialism, and other very human things that have nothing to do with God. Religion can be used to justify good things too. Lots of charities are backed by churches. The few queer and progressive churches out there are fantastic places to start organizing political activism. I'm sorry, because I don't want to be the person that defends religion, but if you want to do good, you're going to use God to justify the good, and if you want to be evil, you're going to use God to justify the evil. But God isn't really on anyone's side, you know what I mean? I'm personally very fond of the meme, Jesus was a socialist. Not just because it makes, white Americans lose their absolute minds, but also because, it's not true. I've said on this channel a few times that progressive politics is not something that you are, it's something that you do. And I really stand by it. I think it's really important to remember that politics is ultimately about power and money, about the material lives of the individual people who are alive today. Good politics is, in my very personal opinion, when more people have more control over their own lives, when more people have more possibilities to build for themselves a life that they actually do like. So, my very own personal political views is that this is the direction that I think we should go towards. And what ideologies we use to justify getting there is important, but I think it's ultimately secondary to the practical and material things we're trying to accomplish. Some ideas are definitely better than others, fuckcentrism and fact-fascism in particular, but there is no such thing as an ideology that will surely and certainly lead to a good world. I don't think that's a productive way to think about politics. But hey, what the fuck do I know? That's a story for another time. Back to New Atheism. It's almost as if New Atheism convinced itself that, one, all of the problems that we have in society are because of religion, brackets, they aren't. Religion is an enabler but not a cause of those problems. And then two, because of thinkers like Hitchens and Dawkins, the West has entered a somewhat post-religious era. Brackets, it hasn't. It's impossible to get rid of millennial of tradition in such a short amount of time, especially without any radical set of policies. And therefore, three, this new and enlightened post-religious West is now in a, quote, clash of civilization with the backwards, barbaric, and still religious Islamic world. One example of this, quote, clash of civilization mentality came much after the death of New Atheism during January of 2015, when Europe saw its own mini version of the 9/11 attack. If you remember, the headquarters of magazine Charlie Hebdo became the target of another terrorist Islamic attack from Muslim fundamentalists. The Western world was so quick to rile up in support of Charlie Hebdo, and very rightfully so, that I think we kind of forgot to check who we were rallying up with. Overnight, Charlie Hebdo became a beacon of free speech, an incarnation of European Western values, and frankly, I don't think that was excellent casting for it, because Charlie Hebdo has a habit of anti-Islam sacrilege, and that's not very tolerant in my opinion. I'm talking things like drawing the Prophet Muhammad in gross and sexually compromising positions. And by the way, this sacrilege is not done in the name of debate or philosophical discussion, but rather in the name of mockery. I don't think that's very Western values of them. I don't think that's very tolerant of them. But Charlie Hebdo's sacrilege was not seen as a representation of the West, while the Islamic terrorists that attacked Charlie Hebdo were painted as an example of what Muslims are like. I think New Atheism ended up being a way to justify a lot of these double standards, and this is just racism, okay? You get my point. In the end, the movement went through a schism because when feminist discourse rolled around, the straight white guys within atheism were suddenly asked by their own movement to reflect on their privilege. And I think these dudes just lost their fucking minds. Being asked to acknowledge the patriarchy and the ways in which we are complicit in it is an emotionally uncomfortable thing. And I suspect that the dudes within New Atheism felt shamed by feminism in the same way that they felt shamed by religion. I think they felt emasculated and embarrassed in a way that reminded them of the church. So they attacked the, quote, SJWs with the same weapons. Mockery, aggressive, dude bro, pseudo debates, name calling, strawman arguments, anything really that gave their brains an excuse to not engage with the emotional side of the issue and with the actual arguments that feminism was making. And this is, by the way, an issue that is still present on YouTube with the whole destroying woke college snowflakes things that a lot of conservatives are doing. Like, many men feel emasculated by feminism, or rather, by a straw man, twisted version of feminism that is created specifically to farm rage clicks out of them. And I don't know, Ben Shapiro is trying to hitch slap the progressive politics out of this, guys. And it's not working, but this is a weird pseudo-intellectual machismo, not an act of rationality. Honestly, forming an opinion that is based, at least in part, in your experience is not emotional, and not being aware of your status quo bias is hardly rational. In her video about New Atheism, the ContraPoints made for her Patreon, she traces the beginning of the schism back to a 2011 event called Elevator Gate. A woman in the movement within New Atheism made a video where she was complaining about being uncomfortable at an atheist event because a man hit on her in the elevator, and atheist men completely lost their shit over this. This was kind of insane, actually. I majored in physics, so I'm quite fluent in nerd misogyny, and many nerdy spaces are not aware of their misogyny specifically because they conflate it with rationality. But there is hardly anything rational about sexism, homophobia, and thinly veiled racism, especially for a group of people that wants to protect others from religious oppression. I have been going back and forth on the topic of God and whether or not I choose to believe in him. I think I'm still more on the side of no, because frankly, heaven, hell, or big sky daddies, these ideas still don't make much sense to me. But it's also becoming more and more clear to me that a part of me has been hurt by religion, by the shame that comes with it, and it's a hurt that is very ancient. It's very deep. I mean, it's the premise of the whole zine, right? This is filled with like 60 pages of Catholic angst, and it still feels like I'm just getting started. I mean, I wanted to write this because it's obviously very personal, but I also have decided that I want to work through this pain because I think that there is something good on the other side of it. I don't know what it is yet, you know, like I'm in the middle of it, but there's something there. And for me personally, I'm starting to feel like atheism is just not enough anymore. I actually have a feeling I'm not the only one. Like maybe this is probably a thing of just my own little internet bubble, but I have a feeling that Gen Z is gonna like somewhat bring back unironically believing God, because like honestly it's like life's too tough to not have a big sky daddy imaginary friend on your side, you know. I think that Gen Z is somewhat gonna bring it back, but like we're gonna make it progressive this time, question mark, fucking hopefully. I want to say that atheism for me represents a good thing. I'm glad this one was the internet movement that accompanied most of my very formative years. It was a period of deep pain for me, adolescence and stuff like that, and I'm glad atheism was there with me. When I was coming of age in a society that deemed fundamentals, parts of me, as sinful and deserving of infinite shame, atheism provided good talking points and great jokes. And it shielded me from the worst of it all, and for that I am grateful. Atheism also provided me with a connection to the universe, only in a secular way, you know, like for me finding beauty in scientific discoveries was a way to give meaning to a life full of pain. Ever since I was a child watching Piero Angelo's show past my bedtime, which is kind of like Italian Carl Sagan, I've found in atheism and in science the acceptance that I didn't feel from Catholicism. And for this, like, beauty, this connection to the universe that is very secular, I am very grateful. But also, yeah, I'm banging more and more against an emotional wall. Atheism is a very effective way to intellectualize away that ancient pain. But yeah, it's just not enough anymore. I don't think I want to numb it away anymore. I don't think I can, to be completely honest. I think my edgy, like, atheist 15-year-old self made the same mistake that Catholicism was asking of her, just in a roundabout way. I think back when I was 15, I was like dissociating from my body. It's just that like I was doing it in a quote-unquote intellectual way rather than a religious way. I just forgot about like the animal, the soft thing that lives within, you know? I have a feeling that a lot of new atheism was trying to debate and intellectualize away an ancient pain, an ancient shame, you know what I mean? I've been an atheist for all my life, frankly. I still remember the time in which like I was forced to go to church as a kid and just privately thinking, this is bullshit, this, like, we all know that this is bullshit, that kind of stuff, you know? I remember the time that I quote-unquote came out as an atheist to my mom. It's always been there, you know? I have a safe place to come back to if God ends up making me uneasy again. So if it's alright with the edgy boys that have metaphorically held my hand throughout all of this, I'm ready to take a break from atheism and see what parts of myself I can find beyond it. So, boys, it was a pleasure dunking on creationists with you. I wish I had a fedora to do this. I am an American. Red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather. Che c'è?
Niente, che ci deve essere? Sei bella, brava, stai tranquilla. Non respira di sollievo. Uno, alzati, fai una capriola, 2 saltelli.
No, ci siamo. Ah, no! Mi distratto, ah! That was the best take of my entire career. I am so good at this. I am tired, and I've been filming for 11 years.